This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 72. Before we jump in, we wanted to let you all know that we are reopening the question submission form, so send those questions our way. All right, for our first question, Rado from Slovakia asks, is the mother more important than the father? Does biology support equal parenting?
Rado, there is no way on earth I'm going to answer your question, and I can't believe you even asked it. I'm supposed to opine about who plays the more important parental role, the mother or the father. I'd have to be crazy to go anywhere near that with a 10-foot pole. So what I'm going to do instead is pretend you asked a slightly different question and answer it, which is genetically, who plays a bigger role, the mother or the father? Now, everybody knows the answer immediately, which is they play equal roles. You got an egg and you got a sperm, and each of them have half the normal amount of DNA, and the sperm gets into the egg, and you merge the two halves, and Bob's your uncle. You got the whole genome there, and the egg is fertilized and off and running. So, according to standard dogma, you get 50% of your DNA, your genes, from each parent, equal contribution. But it's not actually like that. And for that, we have to take us back to the middle school trauma of learning about organelles. Organelles, parts of cells, subparts, little specialized subsections of cells. Organelles, for example, the nucleus, which is where the DNA is kept. There's organelles that are involved in the building of new proteins. There's organelles that do the breakdown of old smelly proteins that are past their expiration date. And then there's an organelle that's responsible for producing energy for the cell. And every single human on earth has heard this cliche. We are talking about mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cell. Mitochondria. Average cell has 1 to 2,000 of them floating around inside, and they are highly efficient at generating energy. And there's all sorts of mitochondrial diseases that you do not want to get. It is an important part of the cell, which winds up being very pertinent to this question of maybe you're not getting half your genetic material from your mother and half from your father. And for this, we have to look at one of the most important dramatic moments in the history of life on this planet. And this was prompted by the work of a biologist named Lynn Margulis, 1967. She spent most of her career at Boston University, University of Massachusetts, incredibly creative, groundbreaking scientist who, of course, spent decades nobody believing her. But she came up with what is now known as the endosymbiotic theory of what's up with mitochondria. And what she made the very convincing argument of, and which appears to be absolutely correct, is that mitochondria didn't used to be organelles inside cells. They used to be independent organisms, little tiny organisms going about their own selfish DNA desires. Oh, they had their own DNA, they had their own genes, they had their own genome. And what you saw was a mammoth war going on between mitochondria and bigger cells, where mitochondria would puncture holes in cell membranes of the big cell and get in there and start parasitizing the cell to make more copies of themselves. And the cell would have all sorts of defenses to try to perforate the membrane of the mitochondria and kill it. And the mitochondria had means of chopping up the host cell's DNA and killing it. And this gigantic battle that would go between single cell organisms, mitochondria, and far bigger single cell organisms, a much more conventional cell. And then in a moment that changed everything, there was a peace treaty between the mitochondria and the large host cells, in that they figured out a symbiosis. Mitochondria, part of what made them very successful is they were way more efficient at producing energy than virtually any other type of cell. And for those who care about it, they invented oxidative metabolism, the use of oxygen to generate energy, as opposed to anaerobic, a lack of oxygen. Super efficient. They're great. And a peace treaty was worked out between mitochondria and large host cells that they invaded, which is mitochondria would produce the energy for the big cell. And the big cell, in return, would provide this safe sanctuary for mitochondria, so things in the outside world that might scarf them up are not able to. This was this great symbiotic relationship that emerged, and peace in our time. And we had mitochondria being part of larger cells ever since, mitochondria becoming organelles. Of course, this is not to say that mitochondria and host cells immediately trusted each other in the first billion years or so. And you saw something remarkably like in medieval times. Two kings have been at war and they form a treaty, they form a peace treaty, and they're going to be BFFs forever because of this peace treaty, but they don't actually still trust each other. And what is done is typically the son of one of the kings goes and lives in the other kingdom, where he is an honored guest, parentheses, hostage. And if this kingdom sticks to the treaty and all of that, it's terrific. This prince winds up marrying the daughter of that king, and these two kings love it, and they get together at grandparents' visiting day for the grandkids' preschools, and it's terrific. And if it turns out these were not trustworthy folks, the prince's head winds up on a big pike outside the castle there, and something very similar occurred, reflecting the host cell having the dominant role. Mitochondria gave up some of their DNA. Some of mitochondrial genes were transferred into the nucleus of the host cell. What's that about? You, mitochondria, don't even dream about ever going rogue and trying to punch your way out of here and go survive on your own, because you have given some of the genes to the main nucleus there in the cell, and you are not an autonomous organism anymore. Okay, so with them not trusting each other, nonetheless, for billions of years now, big cells have contained mitochondria, which are really important in terms of producing energy. So this is where we get to why you are not getting 50% of your DNA from your mother and 50% from your father. So you've got an egg. An egg is gigantic, and it contains a nucleus with the DNA, half the normal amount, ready to meet the right sperm cell with its half the DNA. You got the nucleus, you got everything else, and you got mitochondria galore. Again, couple of thousand of them in a typical cell like that. And along comes the sperm which is minuscule in comparison with the egg. The sperm, which is basically half the normal amount of DNA in a little package in the head of the sperm, and a tail that flagellates or flagellates or whatever the term is like crazy, and powers it where it then is able to penetrate into the egg and release its DNA, and happily ever after. What the dogma used to be is that a sperm contained nothing except the DNA that was needed for fertilization. During this process of meiosis is when half the DNA was lost. That's all sperm are. What people more recently figured out is there's some mitochondria in sperm cells, but they're mitochondria that are just meant to power the tail there, and they're pretty much shot by the time fertilization occurs. Aha! All you get from the sperm are your father's DNA from the nucleus. What you get from the mother is the DNA from the nucleus plus the DNA from all the mitochondria. You don't get any mitochondria from the father. All of your mitochondria are derived from the mother. And like a rough rule of thumb, I'm sure it's not exactly this, but the result is something like 51% of your genes come from your mother, 49% from the father. Not a huge difference. Nonetheless, mitochondrial genes are really important about metabolism and cells, about brain function, about personality differences, and thus you have this inequity. You get the majority of your genes from your mother. And then there's an additional thing that creates an imbalance. And this is something people have just been appreciating in recent years, something called maternal fetal microchimerisms. What's that about? You've got a pregnant female, and as is the case with everyone, there's a bunch of her stem cells in the circulation, and it happens some of them get past the placenta and in the neighborhood of the fetus into the womb, and some of them get absorbed and incorporated into the fetus, where those stem cells differentiate into muscle cells and liver cells and bone cells and neurons, and you wind up having a certain number of cells in your body that are not genetically you, but are rather 100% genetically your mother. You might ask, what about in the other direction, fetal maternal microchimerisms, and the same exact thing, which means that every woman, for example, who has ever given birth to a son, has some cells in her body that are XY rather than XX. But just at the kid end, the kid now gets, well, hello. The kid gets not only 51% of the DNA thanks to the mitochondria, but also gets a certain number of cells, and a very, very rough estimate in the field suggests that in your average person, 8 to 10,000 neurons in your brain are entirely genetically your mother's, rather than the roughly 50-50. We know now it's not actually 50-50 normal thing that you see in your own cells. So genetically, all sorts of ways in which it is not exactly equal inheritance from both parents.
Next, Caroline from Texas says, I recently watched your lecture on emergence and complexity, and at the very end, you mentioned that if we know complex systems can arise from the bottom up, quote, you don't need blueprints, and implicit in that, you don't need someone to make the blueprints. It sounded like you were about to elaborate on that point, but the video cuts off. I was really curious, what were you going to say next? Why is it important to specify that you don't need someone to make the blueprints?
Caroline, it was cut off intentionally because I was being coy there, letting people fill in what I was not saying. Okay, let's look at what it means when a system has top-down control versus bottom-up. And let's start with an example of bees. Bee dances. A bee goes out and finds a food source, pollen or whatever, and it's great, and it comes back to the hive. And famously, bees now dance in the hive in a way that contains information, telling you in what direction the food resource is, how far you go, how great of a resource it is. And this is how the bee communicates this. This was classic work of this guy, Carl von Frisch, who started bee dancing, and he got the Nobel Prize for this as one of the fathers of ethology. This also gave rise to the best title I have ever seen for a science paper, which is to say different bee colonies differ as to how clean they are in their dancing, how exact their communication is, their transmission of this information. Some bee colonies have better Darwinian survival than other ones because they're better, clear at communicating. And the term in the business is they have better Darwinian fitness. And thus the title of the paper was something like Bees Achieve Fitness Through Dancing, which I assume ever since then, people doing a search for like Zumba classes near them are going to like stumble into that paper instead. So you got bee dancing that could communicate. What would it look like now when you have a quandary, which is two bees go out and they both find a food resource the same distance away, and one of them is twice as good as this one, and they come flying back. What would a top-down system look like? Now, those two bees are taken for an audience with the queen, and each dances, saying what direction and how far you go and how much there is. And the bee that has the better resource, it's twice as good. And the rule is it dances for twice as long. And the queen then sits there and says, well, let's compare these two options. The queen as executive comparator and says, whoa, this one is twice as big. Okay, everybody, we're going out in this direction to get that resource. That's what a top-down system would look like, with a queen who has the executive role with knowledge about both resources. What happens instead is a bottom-up system. So the two bees go out and they both find their food source, and this one is twice as wonderful as this one, and both bees come back, and the rule is each one of them is transmitting that direction, this far, but the difference is this bee dances twice as long as this bee does. So is this where the queen comes in? No, not at all. The next rule is they're doing this on the floor of the hive, dancing around, and the rule is everybody else is sort of wandering around randomly, and if they bump into one of the dancing bees, they decode what the bee is saying and go out and find that food resource. So we've just finished the first dancing session of these two explorer scout bees that have come back, and as a result, this one, on the average, one bee has bumped into it, and thus there's now the original bee and this bee ready to go out and get. But because this bee has been dancing for twice as long, statistically, two bees have bumped into it. So at the end of the first round, there's the original bee and the recruit ready to go out, and the original bee and two recruits. So at the end of the first round, 3 bees go out versus 2. By the end of the next round, 9 bees go out versus 4. Then 27 bees versus 8. And by the 10th round of this or so, there's 30 times as many bees going out this way. And the entire colony converges at that point, and they have found the optimal resource. They have chosen the better of the two options, and they did it without there being a single bee who knew anything about more than one of the resources. You didn't need an executive comparator to weigh the two. Instead, jargon in the field, it was an emergent property of the system that as long as there was a relationship between how great of a resource it was and how loudly a bee would broadcast it afterward, how loudly you broadcast twice as long, and thus you recruit twice as many individuals, and it just amplifies exponentially. You have an emergent bottom-up system without a comparator, without an executor, without a blueprint maker. So what was I alluding to with this? In that lecture, you now see bottom-up emergent systems like this that explain all the incredible things that social insects do, and ant societies and termite ones, where it's beautiful because they come up with these adaptive fit solutions to all sorts of social problems, where each individual member of this group only has a couple of simple rules. If you're a scout bee, your rule is you come back and you dance to say what direction, how far, and the better the resource is, the longer you dance. That's all you need as a rule. And if you're one of the randomly stumbling around bees in here, all you need is a rule that if you bump into a dancing bee, you see what it's telling you, what direction, how far, and you go investigate. Simple rules, and out of that emerges an optimized solution for how to pick a better resource over a lesser one without anybody knowing about both resources. So this emergent stuff is going on out the wazoo among all sorts of social insects. This is how the brain wires up also, to find optimal solutions that maximize the amount of connectiveness for the minimal amount of cable that you have to form in there, and all sorts of beautiful, complex systems are built of simple bottom-up emergent rules, where you just have simple component parts, one very unsophisticated bee that only has a couple of rules about life, one very unsophisticated fetal neuron that only has a couple of rules about how to wire up with neighbors, and you throw enough of them together and out emerges these beautifully adaptive systems. So that's great. Emergent complexity, I love it. It's the best. And what it does is describe how you can get these wildly adaptive, beautifully complex systems where all of the component parts are simple and just have a couple of rules, and nobody is sitting there having knowledge of more than one's individual data set. Nobody is a comparator who's giving out directions. Instead, the optimal solution emerges out of this bee dancing for twice as long as that bee. Okay, so now you kind of get a sense of where I was going with that. What have been some of the classic theological arguments for how nature tells us there is a deity or deities out there? And one of them is this argument is called one of irreducible complexity. Can't go into it here. It'd be great if somebody asked about it because it's totally cool why it turns out that this is not an argument that shows evolution can't be for real. But another component of the argument, if you look at nature and that proves there is a God or gods, you look at nature and you see these incredibly ornate, beautifully adaptive, complex things. This was a very 19th century parson going out to collect butterflies and glory in the variety of species of butterflies. And the variety was to the glory of God and God's taste for all sorts of biological variety and beautiful. And this was an emphasis on the massive complexity and adaptiveness and the variance of natural systems as a demonstration that there is a God. How do you make that leap? And this was made most explicitly, most famously by this British theologian, William Paley, around 1802, 1804 or so, who used a metaphor taking advantage of a very new, highfalutin, cutting-edge technology at the time, which was something approximating the modern watch. And he said, you see something as amazing and adaptive and complex, you see something as amazing as a watch, there's got to be a watchmaker. And that has been the stand-in notion. The watch implies that there is a watchmaker because that's how watches are made. And what's the whole lesson of bottom-up emergence? Watches can self-organize. Again, that's the term in the field. Biological systems over and over self-organize into complex adaptive systems without a watchmaker, without top-down instructions, without having to infer some master blueprint maker who's in charge of it all. Instead, it just emerges.
Finally, Conrad from Poland says, occasionally, when two children are having a fight, parents of one of them will intervene and either talk with the other child or go and talk to the parents of the other child. Is similar behavior observed in other animals, baboons, perhaps?
Conrad, baboons, sort of. Parent intervening when their kid is getting pushed around. Now, most of the time, this is being carried out by the mothers, but every now and then it's a father. And baboon males are not typically paternal. So when they are, that's pretty interesting. And when they are, it turns out they're clueless. So it's worth looking at one example. This was a baboon that I first had in my troop starting in 1978. He was great. He was a young adolescent then named Joshua, and he was fine. And in fact, he was the longest living member of the original sort of cohort of my baboons. So young Joshua was, of course, sort of loping around pointlessly and looking out at girl baboons and not getting any action. And then there was Ruthie. Ruthie, another young baboon who was having her first ovulatory cycles. And the hormones had hit like crazy for poor Ruthie, and she was going out of her mind, going up to these big high ranking males and presenting to them in the hopes of them mating with her. And they had no interest for the first 4 or 5 cycles, estrous cycles that a primate has. Rarely is she actually ovulating, and somehow this translates out into not smelling quite as exciting with pheromones, and these big high ranking males were completely disinterested. Like the entire spring there was spent with poor Ruthie presenting to some big high ranking thug who she'd be backing up her rear end into his face, and he'd be sitting there picking at his nose and falling asleep. So poor Ruthie was not getting any action with these big males, and at an act of desperation, she presented to young Joshua, who mated with her. And they formed a consortship over the subsequent 3 or 4 days of her peak cycling. And for a female baboon who is probably ovulating, an adult female baboon, when she is having her peak ovulation, she'll be with 4 or 5 different males over the course of those 3 or 4 days. So paternity is often a little bit unclear. But here, instead, nobody else was interested. So Joshua scored big time. He and Ruthie stuck together around the clock for 4 days and mated. And against the odds, it turned out Ruthie was actually ovulating during this and had a kid, gave birth to a kid who we named Obadiah. And this was one weird looking kid. He had these wing tip hair going back, and he looked like some sort of dissipated fin de siècle philosopher dying of tuberculosis in Vienna or something. He was a very weird kid. But unexpectedly, Joshua turned out to be a gazillion times more paternal than your average male baboon is. Because your average male baboon who is mated with a female, mated with her for 7.5 hours on her peak ovulatory day, and he's not very good at statistics at figuring out what's the probability he's actually a father. But when you see a male who has dominated the entire estrus period of the female, you often see paternal behavior because you have certainty about paternity. Note implied in that they understand something about sex and birds and bees, but that's a whole other story. And in this case, Joshua had spent every moment with her, and he turned out to be highly paternal. He carried Obadiah around, which made it possible for Ruthie to do a lot more foraging because she had 2 hands instead of just one, and this was very helpful. But it turned out Joshua was completely clueless about child play, because Obadiah would be out there with his buddies and they'd be doing baby baboon stuff and they'd be wrestling with rough and tumble play and they'd all be rolling. And suddenly Joshua would burst into the middle of it and fling all the other kids left and right. He didn't understand. They were just playing. He thought Obadiah was being aggressed again, and he kept breaking up Obadiah's play dates, and the other kids' mothers would go chase him at that point. So he really did not have much understanding of this, but this would be a case of a baboon parent intervening on behalf of their child. So do you ever see instead the mother or the parent of a baboon who's being mistreated by another young baboon going and talking to this one's mom? And you don't see the exact equivalent, but you see something reminiscent of it that is very informative. First off, how does this female, the mother of this kid who's getting bullied by that thug over there, how does she know who the mom is? Do baboons understand relatedness? Absolutely. Of course they do. Their whole world revolves around social connectedness. This was proven wonderful research by this couple, Dorothy Cheney, Robert Seyfarth. Unfortunately, Cheney is no longer with us, but they were together, University of Pennsylvania, decades of beautiful baboon research. And one of the things they pioneered with what's called a playback experiment. They would record the voices of baboons from their troop in different circumstances, and they'd stick a speaker into a bunch of bushes, and they would, for example, play the vocalization of an infant giving an alarm call. And what would happen if mom recognizes her kid's voice? Her kid just gave an alarm call from the bushes, and mom runs over there. And okay, that's cool. But even cooler was you would hear the infant's alarm call from the recording, and everybody would look at the mother. They're saying, "Oh my God, that's Madge's kid in the bushes there who's screaming and crying, and what's she going to do?" And they knew who the mother was. Beautiful demonstration that they understood relatedness. So, what would go on, and this was first reported by Cheney and Seyfarth in a couple of their papers and discussed in a few of their books. So, you'd have this female, and her kid is getting bullied by that kid. And what you would see is over the next few hours, this female would go and aggress this female as revenge for her kid getting bullied by this other one's kid there. You would see an increased likelihood of an aggressive interaction, displacement aggression, dumped on the other female. Whoa, okay, so you see revenge going on there. Interestingly, also, if these two kids get into a spat and then reconcile non-human primate reconciliation, something first described by Franz de Waal, another towering figure in primatology, died last year, unfortunately, but he was the first one to describe reconciliation where two primates would have some sort of tension, some sort of fight over resource, something where they're tense afterward, and what he would show a subset of the time in the next hour, 2 hours, they would have some affiliative interaction. They would groom together. They would do at a higher rate than would typically be the case, and the tensions would be dissipated. Oh, that's a whole story in and of itself. Not everyone would reconcile with everyone. You would only reconcile with other animals who were useful to you. No surprise. So the two kids have some sort of tension, and they would then reconcile. And what you would see is in the next few hours, if the two mothers had a tension over something, they were more likely than typical to then show reconciliative behavior, to present to each other, to groom each other, to sit in contact. So they understood if our kids are getting along, that's a good sign for us. So it's not exactly like you drag the parents in for a meeting with the principal about that kid bullying your kid, and the kid's parents have to come in, but you definitely have something with some resemblance to that.
That's it for episode 72. Submit your questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.